Hello, everyone. I think this year's conference has a great meaning in terms of where most of other conferences was focusing more on the technology or crypto part of the agendas. But I'm very glad to see that this year's conference is more focused on the specific agenda, which is data privacy. And then not only the whistleblower for the other matters, but also this is a great whistleblower moment for the blockchain industry as a whole. So thanks for coming. And then I would like to start with our session with like past of the data matters. Maybe Brittany, you can start with our conversation with sharing your experiences, what happens in the Cambridge Analytica, if you can share.
Yeah, of course. And I think if we're going to talk about data privacy, first we need to acknowledge the fact that most of us sitting here today are never going to get our privacy back. Our personal information has been bought and sold around the world since the first time we touched a digital device. And a lot of that data cannot be deleted. It is on the servers of so many companies and governments around the world that what we're really talking about is the future of data privacy. So all of the data that we produce from now for the rest of our lives, how are we going to protect that? And how are we going to make sure that our children and grandchildren don't have the same lack of privacy or lack of privacy if you want to consent to it? Some people would love to share all of their data, but it should be their choice. It hasn't been our choice. So we're talking about legislative frameworks, digital intelligence and digital education, as well as the technology that's going to allow us to have transparency, have consent mechanisms, and then if we decide to share our data, to actually have rights to the monetization of that so that we get rewarded for what we decide to share instead of keep private.
Okay, thanks. So in the previous era of internet that Tim Berners-Lee mentioned that his intention was not the way it is now, but somehow that data has been centralized with a few dinosaur companies, IT companies, and then the monetization of that data is also centralized. And then I think next question to Zan is like maybe most of the people may not aware of your project Blockstack, one of the leading project regarding the data privacy and then Web 3.0 movement. So you can cover a bit with starting with a little bit of introduction about your company and then how you approach towards the data privacy matters.
Absolutely. Blockstack is a decentralized network and developer toolkit that makes it very easy to create powerful applications where users own their identity and their data. At Blockstack, the user is really at the center of the digital world. I love that Brittany talks about control of data. We are really trying to make the digital world, in many ways, reflect the physical world. In the physical world, you have an identity that is yours. You can attach assets to that identity. You have ownership of these assets. There are legal protections over your ownership of these assets, and you can take them and do things with them in the real world. By contrast, the digital world we find ourselves in today is really almost a feudal-like structure. We have no ownership of our identities, let alone our data. And that's why we start with identity. By allowing a user to fundamentally own their identity, we can then create ownership over the assets in the digital world, which is data. You can then go on to have legal protections around those assets and use those assets when and how you want, given your choice. And that's the world we're trying to create.
Yes, that's kind of a like biggest paradigm shift kind of movement where that all the infrastructure as is based on the like client server or cloud-based model. But once that this paradigm really works, that all the database is going back to the individual users, and then all the service actually access to the data. That's the infrastructure of the future. And then in that aspect, not only the Blockstack, but just previously, we had Gavin Wood. He's leading the Web 3.0 movement, as well as the Polkadot itself is building the similar infrastructure as well. And then Ethereum as well. Like we are doing the DID, working on the DID, and then it is critical infrastructure for the future Web 3.0 generations. So going back to Caroline, so not only the private sector, but also OECDs in general, also encouraging the DIDs and then data privacy matters. So what are the activities that you're working on?
Sure. So it's very interesting to talk about data privacy because we talk about it obviously in this context in relation to DLT, but the principles that we're talking about date back quite a long time, and these are challenges that we've been facing for quite a number of years. If I think about the OECD's own work, those of you who aren't familiar, the OECD is a policy research and international standard setting body. We have 36 member countries, of which Korea is one, but also work with many other jurisdictions across the world. And I think back to the OECD's first work in this space, our guidelines on privacy and cross-border flows of personal data date from 1980. So this is really something which has been going on and questions we've been asking about how we manage personal data, who has rights to access personal data for almost 30, 40 years now. Obviously, times have changed, and I think what's really interesting about blockchain is obviously in itself it raises new questions about the updated frameworks on privacy, whether it be the original 95 European Commission regulations in this space, the updated GDPR rules or country-specific legislation, some of which Brittany outlined in her presentation. But those are trying to put those same principles into the world that we live in today. And what's so interesting about blockchain is not just, well, how do you make this technology meet those principles, but also the new opportunities for new business models to change our relationship with our data, and that's something. But I think really that it's the transition from where we are today to where we will be, and I think we are going in the direction that Zan and Brittany have outlined. But how do we get there? And during that period, how do we preserve the control and move towards a world where we control our own data better?
I think that's quite an interesting point that also myself having trouble with, that this whole idea of data privacy is such important matters, but how we can, as entrepreneurs, deliver the concept to the users, where this is pretty new, and then we're so used to in the centralized way of managing the data. So what are the things that we can do to boost up this movement? Is there any, I know you're working on the Own Your Data movement, the foundation, as the data, the digital asset, what is it?
Digital Asset Trade Association.
Yeah, Trade Association, sorry. So can you share your thought on that? Like how we can educate the people?
Well, actually, some of the most comprehensive educational materials that exist right now come from the OECD. I don't know if you guys have ever seen something called the DQ Institute. It stands for digital intelligence, so DQ like IQ or EQ, right? And so how are we going to start bringing up children and also bringing up a society where in companies and in governments, we are being trained to understand our digital lives. I don't think I see a future where kids should be taught how to type and how to send an email without being told every word that you type to send an email to your friend is recorded by the platform that you're using and is being recorded by probably many other companies along the supply chain of you sending that email. And are you comfortable with all the words that you're writing actually being held by these companies? I mean, hopefully a lot of people in this room are creating technologies where that isn't the case, where we could actually send an encrypted email and all of that data isn't being collected by all these different platforms we're using. But I think we should start telling kids, hey, instead of telling your friend who you have a crush on, you might want to say in the email, meet me at recess, and I have something to tell you. So it's just kind of flipping that framework for individuals to understand what it means to lead a digital life, what it means to use a platform, what it means to use devices, and how do you protect yourself. So, both in the legislative and regulatory work that I do, where I'm sitting down with legislators and regulators explaining to them what are these technologies and how is data collected and how is it bought and sold around the world and what are the implications that we need to think of in order to put together common sense legislation. At the same time, we need to create comprehensive educational materials that are accessible to everybody. You don't have to be an engineer in order to understand how you can protect yourself. I think that is a big kind of lacking space right now, where unless you are nearly a cybersecurity expert, you don't know how to protect yourself and you don't have really easy to use accessible tools.
Great. So next is once we talk about data privacy, leveraging blockchain technology, that most the latest technology that gets a lot of attention lately is called the DID. So Jen, you're the member of DIF, and then can you share the latest the activities on the DIF or DID standardization movement towards this building the data privacy?
Absolutely. I was actually just in San Francisco with a number of the other members of the DIF, including Microsoft, and I think we're getting to a point where we have quite an incredible standard in terms of this primitive, which is decentralized identity. And the challenge in front of us now is kind of twofold. The first big one is not technological, it's more social, and it's what Brittany is speaking to in terms of education and legislation, because at the end of the day, if this isn't enforceable in the real world, it only matters to a certain degree. The other side of that equation is increasingly allowing users to take control of their data in easier ways, giving them more options, abstracting the complexity and the friction of a lot of this technology away from that. And I think what's important to remember here too is this is important for two reasons, and I think to actually have this world come to fruition, you need to address both of these. One is on the user side. Educating users, providing them with easier solutions that enable them to see value in ways that they'd never seen before, whether it's monetizing their data or using services with data that they can use across entire ecosystems rather than that being siloed. The other side of this, and Gavin touched on this briefly in his speech, is actually on the company, so the corporate side, the enterprise side, which is showing these companies that data is valuable, but it's also increasingly a liability for these entities that are holding it. I mean, look at Equifax. It's unfortunately one of thousands of examples these days. I think we've become a little numb to the headlines of breaches, and it's showing that this is not just a model that is creating a more equitable digital world for the end user. This is creating a better security model for the internet and for these companies whose lifeblood is there. What we are enabling is a world where, rather than to use the analogy of robbing a home, with Equifax, you pick one lock and you now have stolen the assets of hundreds of millions of people. In this new world, not only can users have a much more equitable existence, but attackers and the nefarious need to rob every single home individually to get the same return. And I think it's important to address both of those, and that's why organizations like the DIF have a combination of projects like us who are attacking the problem a little bit more bottom up, as well as folks like Microsoft who are really looking at it as new ways to architect white label solutions.
Exactly. So I think that leads to my second question towards you, that whether there's this mutual ground of legacy centralized service providers to transit to the DID-based solutions. I know like Blockstack's one of the core is called Gaia, that the big decentralized database, and then how does it work, and then what would be the mutual ground of legacy systems and then future DID-based services.
Yeah, absolutely. So Gaia is our storage layer. What's interesting is it's not actually a storage network. It's more of a routing protocol for how data is stored. The thing I really like about Gaia is it's all about user choice. We don't really believe there's a need to throw away all the incredible infrastructure that's been built up over the last decade or so. We enable users, companies, entities who may be using our technology for their own enterprise solutions to choose exactly where their data is stored. It's encrypted on their end. They can choose to repurpose any of the major cloud storage providers we use today to store that data. They can also use more distributed services like IPFS and others. They can self-host, they can replicate throughout. And what it does is it creates a data layer that is attached to a fundamental identity that a user can own, a company can own, and anyone can really own. And then they can go and permission that across the entire internet as kind of one whole space versus within these silos. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for explanation. Next question to Caroline, that I know that the OECD perspective also working on the DIDs. What would be the use cases that you see in the future?
Yeah. For us, I guess there's a couple of interesting things about decentralized identity. One is to look at the new business models that will be created and what sort of economic implications we'll see from that. Obviously, we've just gone through a period and we've done a lot of work looking, for example, at platform-based models. As that moves into this new area, what does that mean both for corporations, but also for individuals, the type of work they were doing? Will we be able to stop working, just monetize our data, and that's how we'll live? So looking at some of those more macroeconomic questions about the future business models, but also looking at questions like, well, what's the role of government in decentralized identity? You know, for a very long time, governments have been a source of truth, as it were. The issuer of passports, for example, driver's license, things that people rely on an everyday level to prove who they are, which must necessarily have a link with this idea of, you know, decentralized identity, personal data, and storage. Will that still be the case in the future, or will we be looking more at indicators of, you know, being able to identify yourself through your patterns of your phone use, for example? Will there be something, biometric data? How do all these fit, and what's the role of government in that process? Not just in creating a policy infrastructure in terms of, you know, appropriate ways and requirements for managing personal data, but also thinking about government's own role.
Okay, so I guess the next question is for the Brittany. That a couple of days ago we had a little discussion about this, like the character of blockchain itself, as like has both privacy and transparent, which is quite oxymoron cases. And then what sort of the data has to be protected, and then what others can be shared, so can leverage the value for the old social goods. So any opinions you can share?
Well, some of the most exciting solutions that we're talking about here first start with digital identity. And those are your personally identifiable information called PII. That's data that can be used to create your identity. And that's why something like the Equifax hack is such a big deal, because that includes PII data where somebody can now pretend to be you. They can start taking out loans, they can buy a house, they can open up credit cards, they can really, if there are new digital identity solutions available soon, pretend to be you, digitally or even in person. I think probably there's quite a handful of people, including myself, that have been SIM hacked lately because someone took your social security number and another piece of personal information about you and went and bought a SIM card with your phone number on it. So this is why there are certain types of data, your personal information, that always needs to be protected. And any other data that you are producing, from your location data to your behavioral data to your healthcare data, these are data sets that can be shared fully anonymously or pseudo-anonymously, so that some of it can really be traced back to you, so that we can start to solve problems. It makes a lot of sense for everyone in this room to think about that there are some data sets that you would choose to keep private. And that should be your complete choice. That full consent should be left to you. And if you want to share other data sets, you should understand who you are sharing it with, for how long they're going to keep it, what they're going to use it for, and you need to be rewarded for that. That's where a lot of very interesting different types of blockchain technology, from simple smart contracting all the way through platforms that allow fractionalized ownership of data sets, so that you can start to produce data with platforms that are going to provide added value. I think, as I said earlier, if you think about it, some of the biggest problems in this world could be solved if there were more data surrounding that. Right now, most medicines don't work as well on women and minorities because we are not the people that go to medical trials in college. It's young white men, 18 to 35 years old. And so all of the pharma companies actually just have data on those guys. And so medicines are designed for 18 to 35-year-old young white men. And those are the types of issues that we're going to encounter if the entire world just decides to encrypt everything and become private. So while we're at this critical point where there is so much momentum around the conversation between transparency and privacy, we need to understand what is important to keep private and what, if secured and regulated, we could share in order to make a better future for ourselves.
Thank you. So next question to Jan is more of relating to the slight tech matters. So one of the other obstacles about the DID is the key management issues. So actually it's such a fantastic idea that own my own data, but also people has to bear the responsibility of that data, of own data. So, but what if they lose their keys and then they cannot recover it? So what's the Blockstack's approach towards this key management and then recoveries on the DIDs?
It's a great question. I think going forward, it goes back to we see an increasing world of user choice. It depends, first, I think what's interesting is we're talking about identity in kind of the singular. I will have one online identity, and I don't necessarily know if that's true. I do agree with the type of identity Brittany's talking about. Provably unique. It is linked to my real world PII. That will be singular, but I may have other identities for different uses linked to different data that can be pseudonymous or anonymous, and each of those is going to come with different requirements for the level of control I'm willing to give up. At a high level, someone like myself, with my background in this space and in studying this, I probably will always be okay with that added friction of wanting to control my seed phrase, my public-private key pair. People like my parents, my dad's a doctor, he retired doctor in his 80s. I think he knows the phrase, seed phrase, and that's about it. He's never going to manage that, but that's okay. We're already seeing different solutions and services being created, especially the Argent wallet is one I can think of with this concept of guardians, where they allow the user to maintain custody, but they also allow somewhat fractional custody among a number of different entities that can help with that recovery and abstract away the need to manage some of that friction. And I think we're just going to see that increase, and so it'll depend. I could see myself having identities that I do maintain that friction for, and others where I'm more than fine giving up a little bit of the control. At the end of the day, it's just contextual, I think.
Okay. So I guess already spent like 25 minutes, and then actually there's I think we can have a time for last comments on the data privacy in the DID if you have, and then we can get some questions from the audience. So is there any comment or things about privacy?
Yeah, I would definitely say that this space is moving so quickly that it's really important for everyone here to care about so many things at once. One, you should be educating yourself on all of your privacy protocols, on your own cybersecurity protocols. How can you take care and protect yourself? Secondly, if you are building a company, you should start to think about what are the ethical choices that you can make in your transparent and consensual relationship with your customers. Are you going to tell them how they can take care of themselves, what type of data you're collecting from them, and what are their opportunities to get rewarded for more that they are producing in your platform? And on the legal side, if you have a relationship with your legislators, regulators, or lobbyists, even if you don't, it's quite easy to go online and find their contact information. Tell them that you care. Tell them that new data protection regulations are important to you, and that you also support technology entrepreneurs in having their right to develop these types of technologies. Because right now, it's a really key point in time for us to support the blockchain industry and make sure that government doesn't over-legislate and over-regulate us so we don't have the ability to build these solutions.
What makes me really excited, especially with the past 2 so years I've been at BlockStack, is the rate at which I've seen this social shift towards people increasingly having knowledge about these issues and caring about them. I think certainly in the US we've heard forever that users don't care about owning their own data. They don't care about data privacy. And I've been a big believer for the longest time that that's not really the case. The case is they feel helpless with no alternatives to actually take control of this. We've seen an incredible amount of progress to actually start providing those alternatives, and I think we're seeing that play out where it's showing people do care about this. They just need common sense alternatives that they can use. And so I think continuing to educate yourself, continuing to support these projects is very important, but what makes me very excited around these concepts of digital identity and data privacy is I think we've reached already a tipping point where you almost can't really say that people don't care about this anymore. This is the fact, and it's more just making sure that the way this plays out is in a way such that people can take control of this in the best possible way and have the best possible options available to them.
I'll first just pick up something on Zan was saying there is I fully agree that people do want solutions. And the question, I think, as well as, this sense of helplessness, but also we also see people do want a smooth user experience. So what is that balance, and is the technology at the point yet when you can have a user experience which is comparable? Because we do already have some solutions, and we've seen the market shows that people still highly value a quality user experience. And I think until we get to that point where more data privacy conscious products have an equivalent user experience, you know, the market will show where the demand actually is. Perhaps just then more holistically, as I mentioned yesterday, the OECD is working on a framework of blockchain policy principles at the moment. This issue around data privacy is a very important part of that, as well as some of the issues that Gavin spoke about before, trust and governance. And as well as that, to let the audience here know that we're also doing some work specifically on the OECD standards, which get adopted by our member countries and often by additional countries across the world as well, around data privacy and management to take into account the sort of emerging technology sort of environment that we live in. So keep abreast of that, stay in touch, and please, we seek everybody's input. We really need the industry to be very much involved in those works.
Lastly, I just want to mention that a decade ago, this crew, Jeremy Rifkin, wrote a book about the age of access. So where the access means to the centralized way, where the resources are limited. But now that I'd like to redefine the access, the meaning of the access 2.0, that access is all the services that access to individual is the next generation. Okay, I think we have a time. So thank you very much, everybody. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Justin.